Before we get to today's Bible study, I'd like to share with you the Hebrew word of the day. Tal means dew. Do you need God to bless you today? It may surprise you to learn that in the deserts of the Holy Land, one of the things people rely on for life is something most of us rarely even think about. Dew. D-E-W. See, it doesn't rain much in the desert, but moisture in the air at night that comes from the Mediterranean means that morning dew can be quite heavy in early summer. The Hebrew word we translate as dew is tal, which throughout Scripture is a word picture of God's blessing and mercy. Since desert people were dependent on dew to water their crops so they could survive, it's easy to see why this overnight condensation became a symbol of God's favor and blessing on a daily basis. What I love about this is that dew is less obvious than rain. Rabbi Ruth Gias says, to be aware of the dew is to become alert to all of the hidden goodness of God that we so often take for granted. God's undeserved kindness may not always be obvious to us every day, but like dew in the desert during summer, it's always constant. Do you need a reminder of God's goodness today? Do you need to be made aware of His blessings in your life? Pray for God to remind you today of His undeserved kindness. This was a reading from 52 Hebrew Words Every Christian Should Know by Dave Adamson, published by Christian Art Gifts. You can purchase this on Amazon, or you can contact Christian Art Gifts at their website. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host, and here's my caffeine. In the beginning, coffee. Say it with me. And lo, it was very good. Okay, today's podcast is going to be a little lengthy because I just couldn't find a place to stop. So we're going to jump right to it. Verses 19 and 20 says, what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, so no one is without excuse, right? Well, as most of you know, or many of you know, and if you don't know, you're about to know. I grew up in Alaska. I was surrounded by trees and mountains, oceans, rivers, lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors. I watched bears move through the brush, and deer step quietly along the tree line. I saw salmon fill the streams, and halibut rise up from the depths. Ducks and geese traced their ancient paths across the water and the air. Everything around me existed in a balance and harmony. I didn't know to call it God's creation then. I wasn't a Christian. But I knew deep in my bones that something bigger than I had a hand in it. The world felt alive. It felt purposeful, ordered in ways I couldn't explain, but instinctively recognized. I'm open to the thought that in this period of my life, I was informed by my association with members of the Tlingit community in Sitka, where I grew up. As my older brother had married a woman from the Raven clan, some of them had a respect for nature that seemed to go beyond merely being impressed by its beauty. They saw something in nature that went beyond a beautiful accident, something spiritual. You see, in Southeast Alaska, where I grew up, the Tlingit culture is rich with spirituality. It does not begin with a single abstract deity to be analyzed and depicted. Instead, it understands life as relational and animistic. Their world is alive with presence and meaning. Animals, land, water, ancestors all carried spiritual weight. Belief is not separated from identity. It's woven into clan history, the land they inhabit, the creatures they honor, and the stories they tell to remember who they are. For the Tlingit, spiritual forces are not theoretical. They're obvious. They're everywhere. There's no embarrassment about this unseen world, only respect for it. And within that worldview, there are both good and evil spiritual forces. Now, their view was not Christian, to be sure, But many in that culture recognized a spiritual component expressed in the world that they lived in. Though the Tlingit do not believe in the Christian God, or many within that culture do not, they clearly recognize that there is a spiritual reality surrounding us, an unseen force, a presence beyond the material world. That is exactly what Paul is saying. I can almost hear him saying, if you have a modicum of common sense, you must recognize that there's a God. Look around you. What else explains what we see in nature? Every Native American culture I've ever read about or studied tells similar stories. The details differ, yeah, but the core is the same. There are spiritual forces at work, an unseen something governing the visible world. Humanity looks at creation and instinctively knows that there is a creator. That awareness is built in. Now, when it talks about God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what's been made so that people are without excuse, Paul makes it clear here that God has never left himself without a witness. From the very beginning, creation has been speaking. The things God has made reveal his eternal power, his divine nature, not in a vague or hidden way, but clearly enough that people can recognize as a creator behind the creation. The Native American cultures I've studied and lived among dance around the edges of this truth. Now, this doesn't mean creation saves anyone. We know it doesn't. But it does mean humanity is accountable. The problem Paul identifies is not a lack of evidence, but a refusal to respond rightly to what is already known. People see the world. They grasp that something eternal and powerful stands behind it, and yet choose not to honor or thank the God that stands behind it. That's why Paul could say humanity is without excuse. God's wrath is revealed not because people were left in the dark, but because they turned away from the light they were given. Creation points to God. And when that witness is ignored or suppressed, the unraveling Paul describes in the rest of Romans 1 begins. This isn't ignorance. It's rebellion, producing blindness. Reject the true starting point of wisdom, and everything downstream breaks. It says in verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God or gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So, Paul begins his theological journey here, starting with the most basic premise of all. There is a God, and everyone knows it. Herein lies a problem. Mankind knows there's a God, and yet tries to live outside the purview of its creator. I learned a new term today. As I was preparing this podcast, thought it was finished. But this one thought in verse 21 just grabbed me. And I learned a new term that describes what I'm reading here. It's called autonomous intellectualism. Hang with me. I'm going to take a little commercial break. We're going to talk about my buddy, Taylor Chastain, and his company that ministers to people by getting the junk out of their life. I'll be right back. This podcast is sponsored by Up and Away Junk Hauling, a Christian-owned and operated junk removal service serving the Atlanta area. They offer white-collar service in a blue-collar industry, fair prices, and no-cost estimates, with a commitment to donate and recycle whenever possible. Book online at upandawayjunk.com or call 404-909-4183. Ask for Taylor. He's the owner and a friend of mine. Up and Away Junk Hauling, helping lighten your load. And now let's return to Romans with Paige, our host. All right. Welcome back. Thank you, Taylor, for all that you do, my friend. God's blessings to you. All right. I left us off talking about, I was going to introduce you to a new term, at least new to me, autonomous intellectualism. I guess one way of explaining it, it's the illusion of self-rule. The word autonomous comes from two Greek ideas, self and law. To be autonomous is to be a law unto oneself. When applied to the mind, it describes a way of thinking that claims independence from any higher authority. Autonomous intellectualism is the quiet but powerful assumption that human reason stands on its own. It's not loud at first. It simply begins with the premise, I will determine what is true. So, in connection with Romans 1:21, Paul traces a downward spiral of human thought. He doesn't accuse humanity of ignorance. Quite the opposite. They knew God. The tragedy is not a lack of information, but a refusal of response. They knew, but they did not glorify. They understood, but they did not give thanks. So something begins to shift. Their thinking becomes futile. Their hearts become darkened. The problem was never intelligence. It was independence. You see, when the mind detaches itself from worship, it does not become brilliant. No, it becomes brittle. It turns inward. It begins reasoning in a closed system, cut off from the very source that makes reasoning possible. It's a subtle drift. Autonomous intellectualism does not initially appear rebellious. It feels mature. It feels sophisticated. It feels enlightened. It says, truth must pass through my approval. Authority must submit to my analysis. Morality must align with my conclusions. But once the creator is removed from the equation, the mind must invent its own standards. Gratitude disappears. Reverence fades, and reasoning slowly begins to orbit itself. The refusal to honor God leads to futility. The refusal to give thanks leads to darkness. The mind that will not bow eventually bends inward on itself. Now, what it is not is that this autonomous intellectualism is not a condemnation of education. It's not an attack on thinking. It's not a fear of questions. The issue is not reasoning, but it is reasoning that refuses its creator. There's a profound difference between thinking deeply and thinking independently of God. Imagine two scientists standing at the edge of the same discovery. Both are trained. Both are intelligent, but they begin from different starting points. Scientist A begins with what we call a closed premise. He begins with an unspoken but firm conviction. There's no God. Therefore, creation is a myth. Therefore, any explanation must be entirely naturalistic. And this assumption is not derived from data. It precedes the data. Now, suppose a scientist encounters evidence of extreme fine-tuning in the universe. Constants of physics that appear precisely calibrated for life. Instead of asking whether the data might suggest design, the premise has already ruled that option out. So the reasoning would proceed like this. Design's impossible. Therefore, this must be chance. Therefore, if chance seems mathematically implausible, perhaps then we posit a multiverse to answer our questions. Notice what happened. The explanation was constrained before the investigation began. The conclusion may be sophisticated. It may involve complex mathematics, but the range of possible explanations was narrowed by philosophical commitment, not empirical necessity. Those are big words. He's narrowed his explanations by not including all of the possibilities. That's autonomous intellectualism in action. The refusal to allow certain answers, even if the evidence points in that direction. Now, scientist B, the open premise. Scientist B examines the same data, but begins differently. He says, I will follow the evidence wherever it leads. The scientist may personally believe in God or not, but does not rule out possibilities in advance. When confronted with fine-tuning, this scientist considers chance, necessity, design, some combination. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is methodological openness. Now, here's where error can enter. When a scientist begins with a fixed premise that there is no God, It subtly affects interpretation. Complex biological systems must have gradualistic explanations, even if the pathway is speculative. Information in DNA must arise from material processes alone, even if the origin of information remains unresolved. Consciousness must reduce to chemistry, even if subjective experience resists that reduction. None of these are unreasonable research programs. The potential error lies in ruling out alternative explanations. It's not science that becomes flawed. It's philosophy masquerading as science. In Romans 1:21, Paul describes a mind that knew God and yet refused to honor him. The result was not ignorance, but futility, reasoning turned inward. Paul's concern is not that people use their minds, it's that they use them while excluding the possibility of the one who made them. The tragedy is not investigation. The tragedy is the predetermined exclusion of God. Now, this does not mean that every naturalistic explanation is wrong, that every theistic science is correct. Science and faith are enemies. No, it doesn't mean any of those. It just means that starting assumptions matter. If one begins with God cannot exist, then no amount of evidence will ever be allowed to suggest otherwise. If one begins with I will follow the evidence wherever it leads me, then the range of possible conclusions remains wider. So what's the real issue? It's not microscopes. It's not telescopes. It's a metaphysical posture. One says there is no author, therefore the story must write itself. The other one says if there's an author, I don't want to miss him. And that difference, before a single experiment is conducted, can quietly shape everything that follows. See, biblical faith does not silence the intellect. It anchors it. It recognizes that reason itself is a gift. The mind functions best not when it is autonomous, but when it is aligned, when it receives truth rather than manufacturing it. Autonomous intellectualism says, I will determine reality. Faith responds, reality is already spoken. Paul says in Romans 1:22 that people became fools. He's not talking about intelligence. The Greek word moraino means to be made dull or senseless, and it's passive. In other words, they didn't just choose foolishness. Their thinking was darkened as a result of rejecting God. They claimed to be wise, but once they refused to honor or thank him, their ability to see reality clearly begins to collapse. Paul shows us that humanity doesn't merely deny God, it replaces him. And in doing so, the script is flipped. God is no longer the creator. We are no longer the creation. Mankind assumes the role of creator, creating a God of his own choosing, while the true God is reduced to something made, manageable, and safely controlled. So Paul is saying they do know, but they refuse to honor him as God. They actively suppress what they know to be true. They refuse to give thanks. They push God to the margins or remove him altogether. It's not that people are ignorant of God. They indeed do know that there's a God. Nature proclaims it. So what's the point? Well, Paul's point is not that humanity lacks information about God, but that it refuses to honor what it already knows. Creation speaks, humanity hears, and then humanity decides what it will do with that truth. That's why Paul begins here. Now, verses 22 and 23. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. They declared themselves enlightened, but they only demonstrate that they are rudderless, a ship that is cast adrift, a slave to the currents and the tides. Whew. This makes sense. If an invisible God is removed from the list of possibilities to explain the unknown and mysterious, then all that is left is what we can see with our own eyes. Ergo, all the idols in Paul's day fashioned after animals and any other created being, along with foolish declarations that trumpet the deranged and unfocused conclusions of unsaved humanity. That's a good place to stop. This was a hard chapter, but it really helps me put into perspective what I see going on in the world around me. I'm a professional musician, or a retired professional musician. I have an advanced degree in music composition. I understand music theory. And I find nothing more amusing than people who have not studied music theory, watching them sometimes try to explain a complex passage of music as if they had knowledge of music theory. And some of their conclusions are absolutely some of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. I'm not making fun of them for attempting to understand what music they're reading or playing. I laugh sometimes because I know the truth about that music that they're playing. I know the truth about the chord structure, the counterpoint involved. I know the truth of all of that. And they are so far off the mark with some of their conclusions. It's laughable. I don't laugh at them. That's rude. But that is a small example of this battle going on between humanity and God. Humanity is pushing God to the side. That's what they want. They know there's a God. They're not ignorant. They're pushing him to the side because they want to call the shots. That's what Paul's talking about here. I'll leave that with you. And I will see you next time. This is Paige. Here's my coffee. And I'm out of here. Have a great and glorious day. Bye-bye. Go to Amazon.com and do a search for my name, Paige Garwood, and you will find my Essays in Romans series. Each book is dedicated to a chapter of Romans and will contain the script of each podcast, plus thought-provoking questions at the end to help you with your studies. Again, Essays in Romans in Amazon. Search for Paige Garwood. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige with your host, Paige C. Garwood, thinking with his mouth open since Noah was tarring the ark.